Buenas tardes, bienvenidos a la charla Un diálogo amistoso con el autor, Irlanda y la Argentina del siglo XX. Durante la charla les solicitamos mantener sus micrófonos silenciados para evitar interferencias. El chat se encuentra activo para realizar preguntas y comentarios que le acercaremos a los panelistas al finalizar la presentación. Contaremos con interpretación simultánea al español para las intervenciones del Dr. Keogh. Para activarla, deben seleccionar el símbolo del mundo en el menú de Zoom y luego español. Damos inicio a la grabación de la sesión. El ciclo de Cultura y Estudios Irlandeses se enmarca en la Cátedra Extracurricular de Estudios Irlandeses de la Escuela de Lenguas Modernas, creada en 2015 y auspiciada por la Embajada de Irlanda en la Argentina. Tal como se enuncia en los objetivos de la cátedra, se promueve la difusión de la cultura irlandesa en sus manifestaciones lingüísticas, literarias e históricas, y en las de los inmigrantes irlandeses en la Argentina y sus descendientes. La Asociación de Estudios Irlandeses del Sur se propone el estudio y difusión de Irlanda, su cultura, su lengua, su literatura, su arte, su historia y su sociedad, entre otros aspectos, en particular en relación con la diáspora en la región sur de América. El estudio de la vida de los irlandeses en la región, de sus descendientes y de las comunidades que fundaron, de sus aportes a las sociedades de la región y contribuir a la preservación de su identidad. Buscamos promover la difusión de los estudios irlandeses y a la vez propiciar un ámbito de reflexión y diálogo entre Irlanda y Argentina y la región, en virtud de los vínculos que nos unen, desde la literatura, la historia, las relaciones internacionales y los estudios culturales. El Centro de Estudios Salvador en Uruguay, dependiente de la Asociación Civil Universidad del Salvador, se encuentra al servicio de la difusión de la cultura y de la formación y capacitación de la comunidad. En conjunto, buscamos promover la difusión de los estudios irlandeses y a la vez propiciar un ámbito de reflexión y diálogo entre Irlanda y Argentina y la región en virtud de los vínculos que nos unen, desde la literatura, la historia, las relaciones internacionales y los estudios culturales. Mi nombre es Paula Ortiz, soy la directora de la Escuela de Lenguas Modernas de la Universidad del Salvador y vicepresidenta de la Asociación Argentina, de la Asociación de Estudios, Irlandeses del Sur, AEIS. Un diálogo amistoso con el autor, Irlanda y la Argentina del siglo XX. Es un honor para AEIS auspiciar el nuevo libro del profesor Dr. Dermot Keogh, Irlanda y la Argentina del siglo XX, Diplomacia, diáspora, Iglesia Católica, derechos humanos y la guerra de Malvinas, con el convencimiento de que esta importante contribución permanecerá como un texto de referencia respecto de la historia de la presencia de los irlandeses en Argentina. Agradecemos la presencia de la señora embajadora de Irlanda, Jackie O'Halloran. Le doy la palabra entonces al doctor Justin Harmon, presidente de AEIS, quien compartirá este diálogo amistoso con Dermot Keogh, junto con Juan José Delaney, doctor en Lenguas Modernas, investigador y miembro de AEIS, y con Verónica Repetti, directora de las carreras de traducción de la USAL y también miembro de AEIS. Adelante, Justin.
Muchas gracias, Paula. Buenas tardes a todos. Estoy encantado darles la bienvenida a esta conversación con Dermot Keogh, distinguido historiador y amigo, quien más que cualquier otra persona ha contribuido a la investigación de la historia de las conexiones entre Irlanda y la Argentina. Su trabajo se ha convertido en obra referencial definitiva de las relaciones entre nuestros dos países. Para nuestra asociación, como ha dicho Paula, y para mí personalmente, que he sido testigo de una parte de esta historia desde los años 70, es un verdadero honor marcar la publicación de este nuevo libro, La Irlanda y la Argentina del siglo XX, enfocando en la diplomacia, diáspora, la Iglesia Católica, derechos humanos y la guerra de Malvinas. Nuestra asociación se siente orgullosa de haber podido ayudar con la publicación de este libro con la editorial de la Universidad de El Salvador. Este libro, como muchos saben, continúa el trabajo de Dermot, del trabajo de investigación histórica publicado bajo el título La independencia de Irlanda, la conexión argentina, que apareció en Buenos Aires en 2016 en el contexto de la conmemoración del centenario de la rebelión de Pascua de 1916. Utilizando muchas nuevas fuentes, Dermot Keogh ha desarrollado un análisis transnacional desde 1916 en adelante sobre los orígenes de la diplomacia irlandesa en Argentina y en América Latina, pasando por el posterior establecimiento de una embajada de Irlanda aquí en Buenos Aires, después la época de Perón, hasta el periodo de la dictadura militar, la crisis de derechos humanos, culminando con el regreso a la democracia. Ha utilizado su acceso a los archivos oficiales en distintos lugares, en distintos países, sobre todo en Irlanda, donde pudo analizar los informes desde la misión diplomática en Buenos Aires. Y creo que ninguna misión diplomática de Irlanda ha sido sujeto a un análisis tan exhaustivo. En este sentido, quizás el libro representa un ejemplo a seguir. Quiero citar algunas frases del prefacio del libro por parte del presidente de Irlanda, Michael D. Higgins. El presidente dice que el nuevo libro es de este excelente historiador, traza estas raíces de la diplomacia irlando-argentina. El Dr. Keogh analiza el desarrollo de las relaciones diplomáticas desde la Guerra Civil Irlandesa hasta 1962, la época posterior a la caída del presidente Perón, para luego pasar a estudiar la función de los misioneros y su uso, tal como lo denomina Dermot Keogh, del poder blando, hasta la muerte de Perón y en 1974, es decir, la influencia que tuvieron los misioneros católicos irlandeses y posteriormente los misioneros irlando-argentinos en la sociedad y la cultura de Argentina. Así ofrece una perspectiva de la historia desde abajo que complementa la obra y el mundo de la diplomacia. La historia de Irlanda y Argentina no ha recibido aún el amplio reconocimiento que merece. Este libro, esperado desde hace tiempo, ofrece una lectura sumamente informativa, fascinante y entretenida, y se ocupa con éxito de un vacío en la literatura sobre la diáspora irlandesa y las relaciones diplomáticas con América Latina. Todos los interesados en esta importante conexión tendrán una deuda de gratitud con el profesor Dermot Keogh. Fin de citación. Es un placer para mí estar acompañado en esta conversación hoy por dos personas que conocen bien tanto a Dermot Keogh y su obra como a este nuevo volumen en particular. Como ha dicho Paula, Verónica Repetti es la directora del Traductorado Público de Inglés y directora del Traductorado Científico Literario de Inglés en la Universidad de El Salvador. Ella ha coordinado y supervisado este gran proyecto de la traducción de un volumen que, con todas las anotaciones y otras referencias, llega a más de 700 hojas. Sin su energía y profesionalismo, puedo decir que este libro no hubiera visto la luz en Buenos Aires. Juan José Delaney, amigo, es docente, investigador y gran escritor argentino contemporáneo, que ha publicado numerosas obras respecto a la cultura, historia y lengua de la comunidad iberno-argentina. Antes de dar la palabra a Verónica para iniciar esta conversación, quisiera mencionar que la presentación formal del libro se va a organizar con la Embajada de Irlanda y con autoridades nacionales en Argentina en los próximos meses. Así que va a haber otra oportunidad para tratar el contenido y el análisis del libro. Hoy decidimos organizar, más que una presentación formal, un diálogo amistoso para hablar del trasfondo del libro y la larga conexión personal que existe entre Dermot Keogh y la Argentina. Hay varios agradecimientos que quisiera mencionar. Primero, el Ministerio de Asuntos Exteriores de Irlanda y la Embajada de Irlanda en Buenos Aires para la ayuda financiera para esta publicación. Si no fuera por esta ayuda, no hubiera visto la luz. Así que muchas gracias. Obviamente muy agradecido a nuestra colega Paula Ortiz de la asociación y al traductor, espero que esté con nosotros hoy, Rafael Abu Cheidid, que ha hecho un trabajo buenísimo y que también ha trabajado en el libro anterior. Quisiera también agradecer a USAL Press, Ediciones Universidad de El Salvador, y a Mora Ums, que creo que está con nosotros esta tarde. Y finalmente, quiero agradecer a los intérpretes Kaylee Zavala, Candelaria Gutiérrez y Oriana Díaz de Vito. Muchas gracias por estar con nosotros. En el libro, Dermot Keogh hace mención a muchas personas que lo ayudaron en este trabajo y yo no voy a mencionar sus nombres aquí, pero sí quiero mencionar a una persona en particular, a Fátima Cabrera, que está con nosotros. El libro, como todos sabemos, trata en detalle de la tragedia que ocurrió, la desaparición y tortura de Pat Rice y Fátima. Y quiero mencionar que Fátima está con nosotros acompañada por sus hijos. Muchas gracias, Fátima. Bueno, quizás entonces, Verónica, te dejo iniciar la conversación con Dermot.
Bien, muy bien. Gracias, Justin. Bueno, muchas gracias a vos también porque gracias a tu empuje esto ha sido posible también contar con esta obra tan importante hoy. Explico un poquito cuál va a ser la dinámica. Justin, Juan José y yo vamos a formular las preguntas y las vamos a autotraducir nosotros mismos para Dermot. Dermot va a realizar sus respuestas en inglés y los que quieran escuchar la interpretación al español pueden cliquear en el simbolito del mundo, como dijo Paula, para escuchar las respuestas en español. Así que bueno, sin más, vamos a realizarle a Dermot la primera pregunta que tiene que ver con su conexión personal con Argentina y lo que lo motivó a escribir este libro, más allá de su erudición y su trabajo como historiador, que por supuesto están presentes en esta gran obra de referencia. So, Dermot, can you tell us about your personal connection to Argentina and what prompted you to write this book in particular, and how did the text develop throughout time?
Well, thank you, Veronica, for your question. Before answering it, I'd just like to acknowledge the help I've received from Ambassador O'Halloran and from the Department of Foreign Affairs. And I would just simply add my voice to what Justin has said in relation to the people that he has mentioned. Now, my connections with Argentina, I first went to Argentina in the year 2000. And it was to give a lecture on Bloomsday on James Joyce and the Jews. I had written a book 2 years before that on the same topic, and I was invited by a friend of mine, the late Michael Garrity, who was a journalist and a English teacher here in Buenos Aires. I also had an opportunity to reconnect with my friend of many years, Pat Rice, and his wife, Fatima Cabrera, and their 3 children. Of course, I had known a great deal about Argentina through my connection with Pat Rice, going back to the 1960s and early 70s when he went as a missionary. We had studied together for 4 years, and then I left to study history in University College Cork, or in University College Dublin. And during the remainder of the 20th century, I was involved as an historian and as a journalist, both print and TV journalist. I had worked in Spain, in Portugal, and I worked for television in 1980 in Central America, and then in Nicaragua. And so I was familiar with Latin America, but not with Argentina. So my first trip to Argentina was in 2000, and then I kept coming back until 2019, and I'm sort of unable to get there. I would love to be there tonight, but I'm unable to get there because of the restrictions on the pandemic. I invited Emilio Mignone to my university in 1989, and I invited other Argentines to speak on the situation in the country during the latter part of the 20th century. So when I came in 2000, I was knowledgeable, but not, I wasn't in any way expert on the politics of Argentina. So that in a roundabout way would indicate to you that I think I've made 15 trips to Argentina since 2000. So I was serious about my study and serious about trying to understand the politics and culture of a country that was similar to Ireland, but in other respects, very different.
Thank you very much, Dermot.
I'm sorry, I hope the translators, I didn't speak too fast. I may have done, but I'll correct myself next time.
No, but I think it was just perfect. If not, we'll ask the translators to let us know.
Very good translators in that case. Yeah, thank you. But I'll speak more slowly the next time. So does that answer your question?
Sí, muchas gracias, Dermot. No sé si Juan José, vos querías preguntarle algo en relación al libro anterior.
That you're referring to connections. I would like to ask you, Dermot, what is the connection between the previous one? Le estoy preguntando a Dermot qué conexión, qué relación hay entre este libro nuevo y el que publicó hace 5 años también en Buenos Aires.
Thank you, Juan José, for the question. Really, the previous volume was directed towards providing an answer to what role did Argentines play in the struggle for Irish independence. And it was connected with the seasons of commemorations we're having in Ireland at the present time, moving from 1916 to 1923, from the revolution in 1916 through the War of Independence to Civil War and the foundation of the state, the Irish state, the Irish Free State. So it was really my toe in the water, if you like, for the first time to try and provide an overview of how the Irish Argentines so far, 7,000 miles or whatever it is from Ireland, were so immersed in Irish affairs throughout the 19th century and into the 20th century that they were engaged with the Home Rule movement, they were engaged with the Gaelic League and the revival of the Irish language, they were engaged with Arthur Griffith, and this was primarily through the writings of William Bulfin, who was the editor of the Southern Cross, a progressive nationalist and a very fine writer, perhaps an underestimated writer in Ireland even today. But I tried to provide a narrative that would give people an understanding of how this diaspora were and remain so politicized that their role in the 1921 Irish War of Independence was significant. The support that they gave was notable. The money that they sent was considerable, and their concern for to establish the rights of Irish people to live in a democracy and to self-govern was very much an extension of what they experienced in Argentina from the time that many arrived, most of them around the time of the famine in the 1840s. So that, in a nutshell, is my reason for writing that book. Now, the new book goes back over old territory in the first chapter only, and then I move on to post 1922, and the other 6 chapters in the book are devoted to Argentina and Ireland from the 1922 until the 21st century. Does that partially answer your question, Jose?
Yes, Dermot, thank you for that.
And Dermot, we would also like to know about plans for publication in English, because we are privileged to have the book in Spanish prior to the edition in English. Le estoy consultando a Dermot sobre sus planes de publicación de la obra en inglés, porque tenemos el privilegio en Argentina de contar con esta obra primero en idioma español, y bueno, vamos a ver qué planes tiene él para el futuro
Well, I have to blame this event tonight for my not sending the English version to the publishers today. I was so concentrated and nervous and didn't quite know what to expect from interrogation, this difficult interrogation here tonight, that I wrote to the press and said, look, I know I said I'd give it to you today, but I'm giving it tomorrow. So I'll send the full manuscript to Cork University Press tomorrow, and they expect to publish it next spring. So that gives them plenty of time. I think a lot more time than you had with the Spanish version to get it to print. So Cork University Press took on the role, accepted the book a few months ago, but I needed to do a few more things to it and to polish it a little bit, based on the feedback that I got from you, Veronica, and others in producing the Spanish version. So the English version will derive all the benefits that I got from working with you and your team in Buenos Aires. So that's the timetable. I think it's it's likely that they'll meet that timetable and publish in next Easter, maybe.
Yeah, that would be grand as well. Bueno, muchas gracias a Dermot. Excelentes noticias sobre la obra, la publicación de la obra en inglés. Este es el momento quizás donde debemos decir que está disponible el libro de Dermot en formato ebook. Eso ya lo tenemos. Y en formato papel, muy pronto va a estar a disposición en la librería de la USAL, y luego, bueno, trataremos de generar más canales también de difusión para la obra. Dermot, I'm just telling the audience about the availability of the ebook and either ebook or printed version to come shortly.
That's wonderful news. I think that's a very good, progressive way to get to a lot of people. That's wonderful.
I think Juan José disappeared. Juan José.
Okay, I think there was an unstable connection somewhere there. And I see on the screen that the face of Juan José is above my name. So something is perhaps not going right. But anyway, that's very interesting. Great news. Congratulations on the... there's Juan José. He's back.
I hope you're not criticizing me.
No, indeed. But I just thought for our audience, many of whom, of course, won't know about the structure of the book in detail. I mean, one way to do it would be just to read the titles of the chapters to give a sense of what it is. So I'm going to propose that I just simply read out the names of the titles rather in each of the chapters, simplemente para explicar la estructura del libro a los que no han podido, no han tenido acceso al libro, para dar una idea de la estructura y el contenido. El capítulo 1, imaginando la Argentina y el origen de la diplomacia irlandesa en una época de revolución. Y esto tratando la historia de los irlandeses del siglo XIX y los primeros enviados en la segunda década del siglo XX. Después, capítulo 2, el desarrollo de las relaciones diplomáticas desde la guerra civil hasta la caída de Perón y la revolución cubana. El tercer capítulo, redescubriendo la América Latina, el poder blando de los misioneros y la diplomacia irlandesa en Argentina, 62 a 74. Y el capítulo 4, un país dividido, peronismo, Iglesia Católica, dictadura militar y desaparecidos. El capítulo 5, la diplomacia irlandesa y la desaparición, tortura y detención ilegal del padre Patrick Rice y de Fátima Cabrera. Y el capítulo 6, historias ocultas, Irlanda y la denuncia de las violaciones a los derechos humanos en Argentina, 77 a 79. Y el capítulo 7, la política exterior de Irlanda, los irlando-argentinos y la guerra de las Malvinas, con un epílogo, la diplomacia irlandesa y la restauración de la democracia, la lucha por la paz, la justicia y la memoria. Espero que ha sido útil para los que no han podido ver el libro. I was just giving the title, Dermot, there, as you heard, of the titles for people who may not have had an opportunity really to see it in detail. Sí, yo tengo una pregunta, si puedo poner, respecto a la situación de derechos humanos en los años 70. Creo que este libro nos da una perspectiva única en la manera en que la situación, el deterioro de la situación en la Argentina con respecto a derechos humanos, sobre todo después del golpe militar, impactó en Irlanda. Una Irlanda que en ese momento, estaba tratando de definir su política como un nuevo miembro de la Comunidad Europea y al mismo tiempo un país que impactado muy directamente por el conflicto en Irlanda del Norte. Pero una de las preguntas que se ha hecho es si una política más concertada en ese momento por parte de Europa y una presión quizás más dirigida sobre el régimen militar hubiera podido evitar lo peor de las violaciones de derechos humanos. So I'm just wondering, Dermot, in brief, whether you've picked that up, I think, but basically whether Europe might have been more effective in using its leverage on the military government at the time in order to moderate, possibly avoid the worst of the atrocities that occurred in the 1970s.
Well, I think the short answer is yes. It could have been much more effective. But the unification of the foreign policy of the European Union, or as it then was, the European Economic Community, wasn't as advanced as it would become in a few years later. And the fragility, I suppose, of the situation in Argentina really sort of the individual countries reverted to, I suppose, protecting their own citizens following up on the disappearances. For example, the French concentrated on the French citizens, and there was a tendency in the first instance, early in the dictatorship, for each of the countries to confine themselves to simply protecting the lives of their own citizens. But that was, I think, one of the great disappointments that Monsignor Kevin Mullen experienced as the first secretary in the papal nunciature. He was Irish from County Meath and was a great advocate of human rights and a strong voice at that time. And one of his criticisms of the countries of the European Union, not just the European Union or in EEC, was that they were really only interested in the protection of their own citizens. Now, that wasn't strictly speaking true, but I can understand why he was so frustrated, because that was often the official position. Behind the scenes, I think individual embassies, some more than others, did a great deal to try and help people in a clandestine way, help get them out of the country if they were in danger. And I think Monsignor Kevin Mullen wasn't as clear, or at least just simply didn't know about the activities of, say, the Italian consulate, for example. There was a man called Calami who was very active and very strong in his interventions, and got a lot of people out who were not Italian Americans, but were citizens, Argentine citizens in danger. So I think that the European Economic Community could have done more collectively, but I don't think that the situation had evolved sufficiently to allow it to be that cohesive in its confrontation of the military. So they resorted, I think, to the form of classical diplomacy, individual embassies concerned about their own citizens, and then latterly, some of the embassies, the French and the Italians in particular, that I know of, did an awful lot of work in a more general way to protect those who were in danger, and spirited them out of the country by one way or another. So the European Economic Community at that stage, 76 to 79 or so, 76, I don't think they could act with the same cohesion as they would have done much later on. So, or not even much later on, but even at the time of the Malvinas, because at the time of the Malvinas, they could develop a strategy in the first instance of imposing a boycott on Argentina, which was significantly hurt the exports of the Argentines. So they could do that in 82, but they couldn't do it in 76. And you had plenty of experience at that time working in Buenos Aires, and I'm not sure to what extent European political cooperation. It was only in its infancy. And although the ambassadors met and the principal officers also met independently, and that was of some assistance in trying to develop some form of cohesion, I don't think it was as successful as was the intervention by the EEC in 1982, for example, when European political cooperation had developed much more, and the procedures were much better adhered to than would have been the case in 76.
Thank you very much for that. I think I can fully subscribe to that. The contacts that took place amongst the 9 countries at the time were essentially related more to exchange of information than adoption of common positions or even recommendations that there be common positions. And this was in large part, I think, because European political cooperation, which was of course outside the treaties, was informal, and it took some time before that became formal. No, simplemente para explicar que estamos hablando del intercambio de información que hubo entre las embajadas en Buenos Aires, las 9 embajadas de las embajadas de los 9 países de la comunidad europea en ese entonces, pero fue intercambio de información, no adopción de posiciones en común. Creo que eso es un factor importante para entender lo que pasó en esos días. No sé si Juan José tenía otra pregunta.
No, yo intenté preguntar sobre el proceso de traducción en momentos en que yo mismo tenía problemas de conexión. No sé si salió al aire.
No salió al aire.
Well, entonces le voy a preguntar a Dermot. I would like to ask about the translation process.
Thank you, Juan José. The translation process was very smooth because Verónica acted as the sort of intermediary. We decided early on that everything would be funneled through Verónica's office, and she interacted with the translator, to whom I'm immensely grateful, and ironed out the difficulties. And some were sent to me, for example. But I think the vocabulary in the book and the sort of common culture, like Catholic culture, for example, words were very, very easy to not easy. Well, it's never easy to translate, but it's easier. And I'll illustrate that by giving you this example. One of my books was translated into Chinese, and I sat down for 3 days with the translator, and we worked through the difficulties that he was having. For example, one of the words that he couldn't understand was vocation, and that is vocation to the priesthood. Now, translating in Argentina, that vocation would not be a problem. So there were a range of issues when you're translating into a culture that doesn't have any commonality with the country you're writing about, is problematical. Whereas with Ireland and Argentina, I think the vocabulary, the political vocabulary and the religious vocabulary was intelligible and therefore easier to translate than it would have been into Chinese, for example. So I had a most hilarious time with this Chinese translator, trying to explain to him the concepts behind the words, and he had he had a vice-like understanding of vocabulary, because I'd explain to him, and immediately he grasped it fine, and he'd go on to the next word. But we had no such difficulty with this book, nor with the previous book. So I'm very grateful to the translator, and to, of course, Verónica, who was the midwife of the translation, and certainly sort of fielded many questions. I'm sure she only referred to me when she was in doubt herself, but that wasn't very often. So
thank you for that. I was when you referred to your first visit to BA more than 20 years ago, I would like to ask, what was your reaction when you met that strange character, which is Arius Porteño?
Oh, well, it's a mystery that it's a mystery that I'm still trying to solve. I think the Trinity would be easier to understand than the And I saw that question, want to say that you were earlier on, because Veronica sent me a list. And I was going to say that you know the answer because you wrote about it in your book. And I can give you the answer that you gave, but I then give you an answer that is not different, but it complements what you said. In the 19th century, and when the sort of Irish educational system was so strong, and there was a cohesion within the Irish community or collectivity, which is probably a better word, the educational system did a great deal to homogenize the identity. And you could speak about an Irish Porteño because they came through certain schools like the Fatty or through Mercedes or through, say, and then latterly in the 20th century, of course, things changed. So when the Irish Porteños were being educated by Irish nuns and priests, that's Irish-born nuns and priests, they emerged with a culture that was Spanish-speaking, but had many of the characteristics of Irish culture of that period, because a lot of the concepts, the religious concepts, were transferred from Ireland to Argentina. And I then, when I was looking at this, the devotional revolution at the end of the 19th century and the way in which various religious practices were brought to Argentina and to Ireland more or less at the same time, I think the Argentines had a better filter than the Irish. The Irish tend to take things literally and be terrified by hell and death, etc. Whereas in the context of Argentina, I think there was less terror, at least the terror was less terrifying than it was in Ireland. So Irish Argentines raised in the Catholic tradition probably mediated, modified some of the hellfire and brimstone that they might have got in class and in the Irish schools. So if the Irish Argentines were products of the same school system, then there was a certain homogeneity. But as you write in your book, you speak about assimilation. I think in the 1960s, Irish Argentines, in a sense, because there's a diversity of educational formation, because they're no longer living in the camp, many of them, on farms where they only spoke to other Irish Argentines, and hence the preservation of the language, but the language of counties of Ireland, not just a generic Irish accent, but an accent that was from the Midlands, like Meath or Westmeath or whatever, or Mullingar, So that's the way I sort of was developing my ideas. So I don't think that there isn't any such thing today. There are many Irish Porteños, but I think there is the level of assimilation that has taken place is so great that in the next generation, for example, there will be a break with the language or not so much the language as the vocabulary and the accent that is being used. So I think the students of today, of Irish Argentines, will learn an English that is very much a generic mid-Atlantic English, perhaps with an American pronunciation, whereas you, Juan Jose, and your generation have a strong regional accent that John Banville could say to you, I like you because you speak exactly like my mother, who was from Wexford.
And remember, thank you, Dermot.
Would you dispute anything I've said there? Later, I'm following your model in your book, where you speak about assimilation, particularly from the 1960s onwards. And you may be one of the last Mohicans.
Yeah.
But on the subject of the Irish porteños and I was thinking of the religious congregations, the two main Irish religious congregations, the Palatines and the Passionists. What your book, I think, brings out also is that there were deep divisions within the congregations, partly because of what was happening in Latin America at the time, liberation theology. It was after Medellin, and there were generational differences as to what approach to take. And this was very evident, I think, within the Passionists and also indeed within the Palatines. And I'm just wondering, there seem also to have been some division between some of the Irish recruits who came from Ireland and their Argentine equivalents who were young seminarians. My impression is that some of those who arrived from Ireland were politically rather, perhaps let's put it, naive, whereas their Argentine equivalents were more politically savvy and certainly more attuned to the politics of the moment in Latin America, as I say, particularly post Medellin. So I'm just wondering, do you have any comments on that? Simplemente una pregunta sobre las divisiones que hubo entre dentro de las congregaciones pasionistas y palotinas, las dos congregaciones más importantes aquí en Argentina en estos años, tanto dentro de la congregación y también entre los que vinieron de Irlanda, sobre todo los jóvenes palotinos que llegaron, que quizás salieron del sistema de los seminarios, como seminaristas en Irlanda, y quizás no muy bien preparados para la realidad política de la Argentina de los años 60 y 70.
Well, Justin, this is a wonderful subject for another historian. It's a great topic. I'm not going to dodge the question, but I'm going to say that this should be fleshed out by somebody, because I think it is a very, you're hinting at a very important thesis. When you look at the history of the two orders, very important in the shaping of Irish Argentina, particularly after the chaplains who had arrived earlier, the two orders that came in the 1880s or so, had a great impact. But they were Irish. What you, I think, allude to is the change in the culture of the religious orders, that in two ways. One, that the Palatines and the Passionists recruited successfully into their orders, as did the Sisters of Mercy and other Irish religious orders. And so now you have Irish Argentines and Irish in the same congregations. And then at a later stage, particularly in the 60s, 70s, you have Irish Argentines and Argentines. Now, that would make for a very interesting colloquium, or make for an interesting discussion at table, because you have three different, in a sense, categories of people within the religious orders, in the Palatine. So three of the Palatines who were murdered on the 4th of July, 1976. Alfredo Leyden, Irish-Argentine, Alfie Kelly, and Father Dufault. Leyden and Kelly, of course, by their names, they're Irish-Argentine. Dufault has an Irish connection because he studied in Perlis. So when, in the post-Vatican II period, Medellin, of course, sends the Latin American bishops in a certain direction, and within the religious congregations, you would have had a very intense discussion about the application of Second Vatican Council, of the papal encyclicals of Paul VI in particular, Progressio Populorum, and then the sort of preferential option for the poor. So apart from the not tensions, but the differences within the religious orders relating to nationality, you now have a very explosive element introduced into an already, let's say, divided communities, or communities where there would be a certain amount of cultural tension. And now it's the option for the poor and the redirection of missionary life within these communities. So obviously, as you lay it out, there was tension within the Palatines and within the Passionists. I think that the handling of that tension was something that doesn't appear very evident in the files that I've seen. I know there are one or two meetings where there were very heated discussions, but I think that the divisions within the Passionists and the Palatines were emblematic or reflected the divisions within other congregations in Argentina who didn't have the cultural mix that both those congregations had. That was an added complication. But within the Jesuits, for example, but the Irish Dominicans working up in Corrientes, who had come in the 60s, a very dynamic group of people. There was a certain, coherence and commitment to the kind of pastoral strategies they implemented. Whereas within the Palatines and the Passionists, I think there were radical divisions. But on balance, within the Passionists, for example, Alfredo Kelly and many others plowed a furrow that was very progressive. And within the Palatines too, there were those who followed the same line as the editor of the Southern Cross in those years. So I think you've touched on a very interesting area, but I've only scratched the surface in that regard. It's up to another historian to really go into the cultures of each of these religious orders and try and provide an overall analysis beginning in the 19th century and ending in the 21st century.
Hopefully we have some young historians who will be listening to this who might be interested in taking on that task. But I thank you very much. Thank you very much for that answer. I think it's a fascinating subject. I'm not sure if Verónica, did you want to come in?
Sí, simplemente quería mencionar, mi pregunta no es, o mi comentario no tiene que ver con el contenido en sí, sino que quería contarles que el libro de Dermot es realmente una obra de referencia insoslayable para cualquiera que quiera conocer la relación entre Irlanda y Argentina, como hemos dicho, y quería destacar el aparato crítico que tiene el libro, porque Dermot realmente ha puesto muchísimo empeño en generar una obra que no solo trata sobre los temas que estamos comentando y los que mencionó Justin cuando hizo referencia al índice, sino que también tiene muchísimas notas al pie con información relevante, tiene apéndices, tiene, bueno, fotos, y Dermot tiene una generosidad muy grande porque justamente estábamos hablando de los historiadores que van a seguir sus pasos y que quizás van a profundizar algunos de estos temas, y realmente para cualquiera que quiera iniciar ese camino, el apéndice que tiene todas las referencias bibliográficas es sumamente exhaustivo. Entonces es un punto de partida excelente, recomendable para cualquiera que quiera seguir los pasos de Dermot. Y hay muchísimas avenidas que se abren, ¿no? No es solo esto que estaban comentando recién, sino que hay muchísimos temas que se pueden seguir explorando. Y bueno, como anécdota, a diferencia del libro anterior, hemos incluido un índice de palabras, que lo cuento porque lo hicimos un poco a último momento porque consideramos que no podía faltar. En el anterior faltó y fue, digamos, una pena que no hubiera. Y bueno, gracias Dermot, porque estuvimos trabajando contrarreloj con Dermot, con Susan, con David Nudelman de acá de la universidad, y bueno, realmente pudimos llegar a incluirlo, lo cual nos pone muy contentos porque ahora cualquiera que quiera buscar una referencia lo puede hacer mucho más fácilmente que antes. Así que bueno, gracias Dermot. I was thanking you. I thank you that you got what I was saying, but thank you very much for your support throughout the index work and for including such wonderful and exhaustive references throughout your work. And at the end, with the bibliography, hay películas, realmente es un material exhaustivo el que ha incluido en la obra para los investigadores. Así que bueno, thanks Dermot for that.
Just make one comment. In your introduction, Justin, you mentioned the word definitive. And it's a word that historians hate to hear used, because for me, history and the writing of history is a process, and it may be a milestone, but it's not a terminus. And I would hope that another generation will get involved with the writing of history in a more microscopic way. And there's so much to be done in relation to Irish Argentina. I'm not making a criticism of what you said, Justin, but it's just that I, as an historian in particular, have a kind of reaction, because I've always taught my students that they, whatever they write, it's not the last word on something. And most of them actually believe me, and took on that philosophy. There are schools of history which, when somebody writes a book, it's like Moses coming down from the mountain, tablets of stone. And we didn't follow that path in Cork. And one thing about the book, and it's you put the endnotes as footnotes, which is very helpful to the reader, because when the reader is going through it, slipping back and forth to endnotes is always a problem. So from a design point of view, that's very useful. The only trouble is that on occasions there may be 3 lines of text and the rest is footnotes. So my apologies to be patient, reader. Dear reader, be patient. It may be worth your while.
A propósito de lo que se acaba de decir, me gustaría preguntarle a Dermot cuáles fueron los principales problemas que tuvo que enfrentar durante su investigación. Y si fue fácil, por ejemplo, tratar con la comunidad irlandesa, que es tan conservadora. Dermot, I would like to ask you about your investigation, what the problems you had to face during your investigation, especially in relation to the Irish Argentine community.
Well, this was a book that I enjoyed writing most. And I've written a number of books, but this one I enjoyed because an historian has to deal with the world as it is, particularly when you're trying to get archives, etc. And as I found out when working on Ireland and Argentina, I I began to discover quantities of archives, not just the official archives. And I went to Canada, the United States, the Vatican, various sort of formal archives. Of course, the archives in Dublin and in London. And but I really enjoyed the challenge of meeting Irish Porteños, and I really enjoyed discussing their experience and whether they had documents or whatever. So I found people to be very courteous and very helpful. I was disappointed sometimes because families don't keep archives, but I'm sure there are families that have archives, and those archives should be in the National Library or they should be in some central repository. So I didn't, I worked many years as a journalist, and you take people as they are, particularly when you're an historian, and you need, because every point of view is valid. It's the lived experience of a person, and you listen to what they say, and then you use your own judgment in relation to what you find in the archives and whether this accords with, in a sense, your own assessment as you develop an understanding of the problem in a broader context. So when I went to the Fahy Club, and I always enjoyed meeting the people who were there. I always enjoyed having an asado with them, although because I'm a vegetarian, I often cause consternation for my hosts. So I found the people very courteous, and I didn't depend for my book on interviews. I want to say I had discussions with people rather than interviews. Only once did I use a tape recorder, and I didn't get a very good outcome. I mean, at least my tape recorder wasn't very good, but I interviewed Matteo Kelly, who died, unfortunately, an extraordinary man who could stretch back to the 19th century, his own memories, etc. And so my recollection is of having very rich conversations with people and taking the person as they are and not wishing to impose my views on an Irish Argentine who, after all, had lived 50 or 60 years in a country. I was there to listen, and I was there to sift through the information that I was hearing. And I got on well as a consequence, because I wasn't judgmental. I wasn't judgmental, and I listened to all the points of view. So I understand what you're saying in terms of categorizing, a community, but frankly, I didn't do a sociological study, so my contacts were, somewhat episodic or casual, and in that way, I think they were rich. But my book doesn't have quotations from many Irish Porteños, for example, but I would have internalized a lot of the things that were said to me, and they would have colored the narrative that I was working on if they accorded with the archives, what I was finding in the archives. So I would like to go back and, of course, spend much more time with Irish Argentines. at a convivial level, enjoying the great Malbec and all the rest of it, and discussions, not the asados. But I would like to do that, and I would like to meet more people, because I've been in a number of pueblos in the Pampas, but I would like to spend time there. I'd like to spend 2 or 3 weeks in Bernardo Tuerto. I'd like to go spend more time in Mercedes and then in the smaller towns, because only in that way will you get a really good picture of what it would be to interview people and use their texts, in a literal way, in a narrative. But my narrative at the moment contains in it the material that I internalized when I was talking to people. I wouldn't quote people, particularly sort of if they were speaking to me in a very frank way, but I would internalize what they said. Does that, that's my modus operandi. I'm a guest. I'm somebody who what needs to be courteous and listen and not be argumentative. That's my training, and but as you rightly say, you meet a range of perspectives when you're talking to, Irish Porteños, but it's better to get to know them and then to talk at a deeper level, rather than to hear, what might be said within the earshot of other people, because it's what they're expected to say, because there's a kind of auto-censorship when people are within groups. People have suffered, everybody who went through the recent Argentine history, many of them have suffered personally and terribly. And one must be respectful of their family histories and their personal stories. So that may be a very Pollyanna-ish way to answer your question, but I don't behave like an interrogator. God, Lord knows some of them had enough interrogation in their lives if they were in jail. So I'm simply there to listen, and I learn everything. Every person I speak to, I learn something from them. And what I learn more than anything else is I've got to work harder to understand what's happening or what happened in this country, rather than, close your mind and sort of say, oh yes, that person doesn't understand what they're talking about, doesn't know what they're talking about. So that's...
Thank you for a very good answer. Thank you for that.
Yes, well, you use the same techniques, what I'm saying, so, because you interview many people, and you have the transcripts of your book. So I took a leaf out of your book. So when I was doing my interviews, and I was a good interviewer when I was a journalist, because I wasn't tough. I was tough, but I didn't appear to be tough. And as an historian, I fall back on that professional experience to treat everybody with dignity.
The good listener.
Yes, and listen between the pauses as well. I and somebody who is not a good listener does not make a good diplomat. And I've met one or two diplomats who were so loquacious that I didn't know when they had time to actually stop to listen to somebody who knew something more than they did. That is where they were serving in the country. I'm not talking about Argentina. I'm talking about somewhere else, which I'm not going to name, by the way.
Okay. We won't press you. We won't press you.
Either in public.
No, si puede, un comentario y otra pregunta sobre otro tema, si tenemos tiempo. No sé si hay preguntas de la audiencia, Verónica.
No,
si hay, por favor.
Hay comentarios muy elogiosos, muchos agradecimientos para Dermot, perdón, y cálidos mensajes de amigos también que están presentes hoy acompañándonos. Así que preguntas concretas, no, Justin.
Bueno, no, un comentario y una pregunta. El comentario, un poco siguiendo el tema de esto de la comunidad hiberno-argentino, se ha hablado en varias oportunidades de una actitud, digamos, conservadora de la comunidad, y obviamente hubo y hay actitudes conservadoras en la comunidad, y eso no es ninguna sorpresa. Pero mi impresión con la experiencia de haber estado aquí en la Argentina en estos años es que la comunidad hiberno-argentina reflejaba más o menos lo que pasaba en la opinión pública en general en Argentina. Eso quiere decir que había distintos elementos dentro de esa misma comunidad. Y así que cada vez que escucho la idea, basado a veces sobre uno o dos conversaciones o citaciones en particular, que toda la comunidad adoptó una actitud muy conservadora, siempre hago hincapié en la variedad de opiniones que yo encontré en esos años y desde entonces. Así que quería hacer un comentario, ¿no? Para seguir el tema. No, la pregunta sobre otro capítulo, un capítulo, en mi opinión, muy importante en este libro respecto a las Malvinas. Obviamente para una audiencia argentina que sabe mucho de este conflicto y que hay muchos libros, etcétera. Pero lo que hace este capítulo, que realmente es casi un libro aparte, es saca a la luz el impacto enorme que tuvo el conflicto sobre Irlanda y sobre las relaciones del país con el Reino Unido en un momento clave en respecto a la situación en Irlanda del Norte. Obviamente la posición fue hecho más sensible todavía por el hecho de que Irlanda, como ahora, tenía un escaño en el Consejo de Seguridad de las Naciones Unidas, justo en el momento que hubo negociaciones con Argentina respecto a las Malvinas. Obviamente hubo cambios en la posición de Irlanda en ese momento y eso provocó unas reacciones fuertes dentro de la comunidad hiberno-argentina. Así que simplemente para agradecer a Dermot por justo esto, sacar a la luz aquí en la Argentina el impacto profundo que tuvo, y preguntar si tiene algunos comentarios respecto a cómo estamos ahora, casi 40 años después, sobre todo lo que pasó en ese periodo. Did you understand that, or would you like me to attempt a very brief?
One sentence to crystallize what you said, and I'll answer. I got practically everything, but go ahead.
No, it was basically I think you have done an enormously helpful, or provided an enormously helpful contribution by bringing to an Argentine audience such detail on the impact that the Malvinas had in Ireland itself at a moment of great sensitivity following the hunger strikes in Northern Ireland, and in the context of relations with the UK. Of course, we're now on the Security Council again, but at the time we were on the Council, and that was at a moment of great sensitivity in the negotiations with Argentina. There were obviously the changes that took place in the Irish position, which evoked strong reactions amongst the Irish Argentines. Just to thank you for that contribution, and to ask whether you have any reflections that you'd like to share in relation to the writing of that chapter and its inclusion in the book.
Well, Justin, it would take a long time to answer your question comprehensively, because I think I've written about 70 or 80 pages in the book about the area. I first wrote about the Ireland and the Malvinas in 1983, and my sources were so good that I couldn't publish the book because it would have identified who gave me the material. So that material marinated for many years until I began to write this book, and I fashioned the final chapter to deal as comprehensively as I could with this very knotty question, because for the second time in the history of the Irish mission in Argentina, Argentina entered center stage in Irish foreign policy. The first was 1955, after the church burnings and the coup that toppled Perón, and that was relatively short-lived. And then there was the prolonged period of the Malvinas conflict. And what I found when I revisited the material that I wrote, I didn't have much on the Argentine reaction and on what the embassy in Argentina had reported back. But I think for the first time in the history of the mission, the Argentine embassy was part of the, let's say, the engine room of Irish foreign policy. I mean, it was part of it was the moving parts of Irish foreign policy. Argentina was inserted for the first time into that particular context, because you had an Anglo-Irish dimension, perhaps the most important of the foreign policy and sectors that the country had. You had the EEC dimension, and you had the UN dimension, and Ireland was exposed in 1982 because it was on the Security Council of the UN. So the Irish Argentines were in a unique position, I suppose, to mobilize and try and influence the Irish government to change its position from supporting Resolution 502, which was essentially a pro-British resolution, or let's say it favored the British more than the Argentines, and also to change the Irish attitude towards EEC sanctions, because Ireland had joined on the 17th of April 1982, had joined in the EEC imposition of sanctions on Argentina. So it as it turned out, by the beginning of May 1982, the Irish policy, for a series of complicated reasons that I try to explain in the book, changes. I speak about volte-face, because locked into sanctions, locked into support for Resolution 502, the end of May saw the rather, let's say, shaky government of the Taoiseach of the day, Charles Haughey, reevaluate the Irish position. He was never really supportive of what Ireland did in the early stages, supporting Resolution 502 and supporting the EEC sanctions. And towards the end of April, particularly sort of coming into the 2nd of May with the sinking of the Belgrano. But before that, Haughey was very ambivalent about what Ireland had done in its foreign policy in April. And here's a small connection. Charles Haughey went to the Christian Brothers School in Marino, and he had visited Argentina in the mid-60s as Minister for Agriculture. So he knew Mr. Scanlon, is it who ran St. Brendan's, and he also was friendly with some of the Christian Brothers in Newman. So that's an area that I haven't really explored. Well, Scanlon, yes, but not the Newman connection, because I'm sure that I know Scanlon was was instrumental in using his influence to try and get the Irish government to change its mind. The Irish government changed its position between the 2nd and the 4th of May. It calls for an immediate meeting of the Security Council, which was favorable to the Argentines in the sense that the British were quite content with Resolution 502, and they could work with that. But calling for an immediate meeting of the Security Council was to antagonize the British. And then in turn, Haughey sought to not renew sanctions, EEC sanctions. So because Haughey changed his mind and the Irish government changed its position in early May, and the Irish Argentines were lobbying for Haughey to do this, it doesn't necessarily follow that Haughey, despite the overtures to him from Irish Argentines, necessarily changed his position and the position of the Irish government because Irish Argentines were lobbying him. But sure enough, I mean, he did cause the representatives, the Irish representatives, Noel Dore and others at the UN, considerable difficulties. And Dore managed to change the instruction from an immediate meeting of the Security Council to call immediately for a meeting of the Security Council, which meant that it was somewhere in the indefinite future that you could have a meeting of the Security Council. But withdrawal from sanctions was a major success, again, not for Argentine diplomacy, but it certainly suited Argentina that Ireland broke with sanctions in the middle of May 1982. And that in turn triggered the Italians to have to withdraw from sanctions, because already the Italians were under terrible pressure from Argentine Italians to withdraw from sanctions. So because Ireland jumped ship, the Italians were unable to do so, despite the fact that Colombo and others wanted to stay on. So in answer to your question, this is a very interesting period in Irish-Argentine relations, because for the first time, well, not the first time, because they mobilized to get a legation in Argentina, in Buenos Aires, from the 1920s onwards until one was established in 1947-48. But in 1982, Ireland changed its position in May to what was perceived to be a pro-Argentine position, which it wasn't, but it was perceived to be that, certainly by Margaret Thatcher, the British Prime Minister. Now, Irish Argentines, having been terribly critical of the embassy in April, were ecstatic in May because Ireland had done the decent thing and was perceived to have supported the Argentine position. The Argentine government, in turn, also was not slow to accept that Ireland had changed sides effectively and supported the Argentine position. My text will show that Ireland didn't support the Argentine position, but Irish Argentines believed that they had done so. And so they were very pleased and very gracious in their praise to the ambassador Walsh, Patrick Walsh, who had indicated in his reports that that was the perception, but it didn't conform with the Irish reality. So there, for the first time really, Ireland and the Irish embassy is center stage in the internal debate on the Malvinas. Now, I would say one thing that is counterfactual, and simply just to it's not something I argue in the book, but if, and this is hypothetical, if Argentina had not reoccupied the Malvinas, the likelihood is that where the British talks were positioned at the time, there was a strong feeling that the British would provide a leaseback arrangement to the Argentines, and that it is theoretically possible that had they not invaded, or sorry, that's not the word, had they not occupied the Falklands, Malvinas, there might have been a Hong Kong solution, and that was something that was prevented by the military occupation of the Falklands. So does that answer your question, Justin?
Thank you very much. In fact, on the tapa del libro, there is the editorial, Thank You, Ireland.
They cost a lot of money, $6,000 US dollars, to put that advertisement in 3 national papers, in the Irish Times, the Irish Press, and the Irish Independent. So it was put in as an advertisement into the 3 papers. Thank you, Ireland. And it's an interesting text to have reproduced.
Indeed, yes, yes. No,
reproduced inside the book. So it's a very engaged piece of prose.
I think that has been a very powerful addition to or will be a very powerful addition to the understanding here in Argentina of the impact that the conflict had in Ireland at the time. So thank you for that. Espero que esto ha sido interesante para todos, el tema de las Malvinas y el impacto en Irlanda. No sé si Juan José, ¿vos querías añadir algo?
No tengo muchísimas preguntas, pero
estamos pasando la hora y ya.
Por teléfono a Dermot. No, pero ya que me diste el micrófono, I want to thank Dermot and congratulations for this wonderful book.
Thank you, Juan Jose. I appreciate that very much, and I acknowledge your great help to me throughout the book, in fact. But may I just say that I know that Fatima is on the line, and I want to salute her and to say that my interest in Argentina certainly was stimulated by my friendship with both herself and Patrick over the years, and I learned a great deal in my when staying with them and enjoying their extraordinary hospitality. And I learned also a great deal from Fatima's mother, who is a strong Peronista, and many nights I sat up with her because she had arthritis and couldn't sleep, and we talked into the morning, long into the early hours of the morning, about Tucumán, about the social background and her life in Tucumán, and then later in Buenos Aires. That was a great learning opportunity for me. And again, one of the opportunities where you sit there and you listen and you ask good questions and you get strong answers in the most beautiful Spanish, the most beautiful Spanish. So if people who read the book will see that towards the end, I make a point that that dictatorship was an aberration, that democracy has always been very strong in Argentina, and a dictatorship was an aberration. And the other thing that I note in the afterword is that there was no Dante-like contrabasso. People were presented with due process, and there was nothing like what happened in Europe, in France, and other countries after the war with summary executions, etc. So the strength of the Argentine judicial system came into play at the end, and it was for me, and it underlined the strength of Argentine democracy, volatile as it may be, but nobody was put against al paredón without due. Well, there wasn't that due process took place, and people were tried in a court and given due process. So I see the period of 76 to 81, 82 as a kind of aberration, as were many of the other military dictatorships earlier in that century, the 20th century.
Yo también tengo que totalmente de acuerdo, Dermot, en respecto del proceso y el ejemplo que dio y que da Argentina en respecto de la violación de los derechos humanos en estos años. Y este proceso no ha terminado. Esto fue mi experiencia propia cuando fui como testigo hace poco en el juicio en uno de los casos relacionados con Fátima Cabrera. Así que un ejemplo, tenemos que mencionarlo y subrayarlo a nivel internacional. No sé si alguien quiere tocar otro tema. Hay que mencionar de nuevo que vamos a tener una oportunidad en unos meses de, bueno, primero leer el libro. Los que están interesados va a estar sobre, bueno, como ebook o como empresa, está el libro, y se va a organizar una presentación más formal, y va a haber otra oportunidad para hablar con Dermot y tocar varios de los temas que hemos mencionado esta noche. Pero entiendo que es tarde en Dublín, así que no quiero prolongar esto, pero no sé, Verónica, estás monitoreando el chat. Yo no estoy mirando aquí, así que no sé si alguien quiere hacer algún comentario en particular.
No, Justin, como decía antes, son agradecimientos y bueno, mensajes muy cálidos para Dermot, para el equipo. Creo que bueno, hay que leer el libro, ¿no? Y quizás en la próxima presentación, ahí sí va a haber preguntas para Dermot puntuales, quizás sobre el contenido. Yo quería concluir simplemente con un mensaje personal, con mi experiencia como lectora, ¿no? Ya como parte del equipo de trabajo. Y este libro lo que me ha provocado es no solo encontrarme con una obra de rigor académico y conocer aspectos que desconocía, por ejemplo, todo este episodio de Malvinas y la relación entre Irlanda y Argentina durante la guerra de Malvinas era totalmente desconocido para mí, pero es un libro que no por eso, no por su rigor académico, deja de ser muy humano, y me permitió conocer historias de vida, de trabajo y de entrega como las de Fátima Cabrera, Patrick Rice, Kevin Mullen, que también desconocía y que pueblan estas páginas junto a tantas otras, y seguramente los van a conmover a ustedes tanto como me conmovieron a mí cuando lo leí. Así que bueno, Dermot tiene un estilo muy claro y muy ameno, y creo que Rafael, a quien agradezco, ha sabido reproducir en la traducción esa claridad y esa lectura amable. Así que bueno, simplemente eso, mi experiencia como lectora, agradecerles a todos los que nos han acompañado hoy, a Paula también especialmente, y a vos, Justin, por el apoyo constante en estos meses que fueron arduos, pero bueno, han llegado a buen puerto. So, and a big, huge thanks to Dermot
Here.
for the constant feedback that we have. Constant, comings and goings, but the child is here, Dermot.
Very good. I would like to just say, quiero dar las gracias a los traductores y a todos. Me ha ayudado mucho en los últimos meses y estoy muy feliz. Ahora estoy estudiando español, pero tengo tantos tacos en mi vocabulario ahora después de estudiar con Netflix que no tengo miedo de hablar en castellano ahora. Pero cuando llego la próxima vez a Argentina, vamos a seguir en español.
No, habla perfecto español.
Perfecto.
Habla perfecto español.
Gracias.
Perfecto. Hay un comentario ahí de Fátima. No sé si Fátima querés decir algo. Sí, pues. No lo escuchamos así.
¿Se puede? Ahí.
Sí, ahora escuchamos, sí.
Bueno, realmente conmovida y con un profundo agradecimiento en nombre de toda nuestra familia, los hijos, mi nieta, que están ahí, y bueno, la presencia de Patricio Rice, de todo su aporte, de su humanidad, de todo lo que entregó por una humanidad, por la justicia, la memoria y la verdad. Gracias, Dermo, porque lo acompañaste siempre. Desde adolescentes ya estaban juntos. Gracias, Justin, porque fuiste central y la Embajada de Irlanda en la defensa de nuestras vidas y que hace que hoy podemos estar acá. Y gracias, Juan José, Verónica, Paula, a todo el equipo que acompañó este inmenso trabajo de Dermo, que dedicó tantos años, y esta profunda amistad que nos une. Muchísimas gracias en nombre de nuestra familia y seguramente de Patricio también.
Gracias, Fátima.
Muchas gracias. Gracias, Fátima.
Gracias a ustedes.
Gracias, Fátima.
Bueno, entonces para finalizar este lindo diálogo de amigos, les agradecemos a todos la presencia, los invitamos a visitar el sitio de AEIS para nuestras próximas actividades y a seguir nuestras redes sociales, y les queremos comentar queremos anunciar que el próximo Congreso de SILAS en 2021, que se llama Commemoration, Memory and Dialogue with the Past, Ireland and Latin America, que se llevará a cabo en la Universidad del Pacífico en Lima, Perú, en modalidad virtual del 23 al 26 de noviembre. Así que en el mes de noviembre no tendremos nosotros actividad puntual de la AEIS, sino que nos vamos a adherir a todas las ponencias del Congreso. En nuestras redes van a encontrar las ponencias que van a ofrecer los miembros de nuestra asociación. Y para finalizar entonces, ya vieron dónde está disponible el libro. Para aquellos que se pregunten, están en un precio realmente módico, así que los invitamos a que puedan acceder ahora al libro. No está finalizado, tuvimos algún problemita con la entrega de la materia prima para la impresión del libro, así que en breve va a estar y vamos a anunciarlo también por las redes sociales. Quiero agradecer especialmente la presencia de la embajadora Jackie O'Halloran aquí, que ha posibilitado este libro, y también de Jorge Abuchedit, que llegó un poquito tarde, así que se perdió el agradecimiento de Dermot hacia él, que fue el traductor del libro también. Y a todos los que están acá, porque todos contribuyen para lograr estos logros, valga la redundancia, que tienen la Asociación de Estudios Irlandeses del Sur. Así que bueno, nos vemos en la próxima. Dermot, muchísimas gracias, felicitaciones por este nuevo hijo, y nos vemos prontito. Gracias a todos, abro para todos las cámaras y los que quieran, si quieren comentar algo, un ratito nos quedamos. Hola, Ann, que estás por ahí atrás.
Un gran abrazo, Ann.
Hello, Ann. How are you?
Ann, hola.
Good to see you. I hope you were listening to all that, Ann.
Oh, indeed I was.
Excellent.
Yes. It's a
Oh.
nice water.